In a small rural community in Mexico, where time seems to have stopped and stories travel from mouth to mouth like whispers from another world, a boy named Iker was born. From a very young age, his gaze seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He didn't cry like other babies. He observed, with a disturbing calm, with a depth that frightened even his mother. At 3 years old, Iker began talking about places no one had ever shown him. He said he knew a city with shining skyscrapers and trains that moved underground. He accurately described a station called San Juan de Letrán on the Mexico City subway, even though he had never left his hometown. But the most disturbing thing wasn't that. It was how he spoke of his death. One afternoon, while playing in the dirt near the chicken coop, Iker told his grandmother, "I already died once. It was in a red car that crashed into a wall. I was alone. I was 24 years old. My chest hurt and I couldn't breathe." His grandmother froze. She thought it was just a game, but as he repeated the story with clinical detail and chilling certainty, the family began to suspect there was something more. Iker said his name used to be Mateo Vargas. He lived in a cream-colored building in the Narvarte neighborhood. He worked as an editor for a digital magazine, and that on April 19, 2016, just before dawn, he had a fatal accident on Avenida Universidad. He said his car skidded in the rain, he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and that his body was taken to General Hospital, but he no longer had a pulse. His mother, incredulous but intrigued, began searching online. And there it was, a local newspaper article with a picture of a red Honda Civic crashed into a retaining wall. The driver, Mateo Vargas, 24, editor, died at the scene. Same day, same story. How was it possible that his son, born 2 years after the accident, knew all this? Iker also talked about a young woman named Camila. He said she was his girlfriend in his past life. They used to walk around Parque Hundido and eat tacos at a place called El Greñas. His mother, driven by curiosity and bewilderment, searched social media and found Camila Rivera, who had indeed posted old photos with Mateo. When she showed Iker the photos, they provoked an inexplicable reaction. The boy began to cry with an adult-like sadness, saying, "She didn't see me die. She was asleep at home. I was going to propose to her that week." The psychologists they consulted were at a loss. Some attributed it to cryptomnesia, others to an overactive imagination. But none could explain how he knew names, places, dates, sensations, and even codes that only an adult from that other life would have known. The case reached the attention of a parapsychology professor at the University of Guadalajara, who traveled to the town to interview Iker. He recorded more than 5 hours of conversation with the boy, in which Iker described exactly what the interior of the apartment where he supposedly lived as Mateo looked like. He even drew the logo of the magazine he claimed to have worked for. The most striking thing happened when the teacher showed Iker a set of photographs of various buildings in the city. Without hesitation, the boy pointed to one and said, "That's my house, on the 3rd floor in the back. I like to write there at night." When they visited the place, the details matched. Even a crack in the bathroom wall that Iker mentioned was there. From then on, the family decided to remain silent and protect the boy. They said that every time he talked about his past life, he became exhausted, as if reliving those memories cost him vital energy. At 6 years old, Iker began to forget those stories. Little by little, he no longer remembered Camila, Mateo, or the red car. But his mother wrote everything down. She documented every word, every drawing, every testimony, because she knew that one day Iker would ask why he dreamed of trains he'd never seen, of a city he'd never set foot in, and of a love that somehow still hurt even though he no longer knew why. And that's where the question arises, are we really new when we are born? Or are we just resuming an interrupted story? What would you do if your child started telling you about another life in so much detail? Would you ignore it or look for the evidence? Answer in the comments, do you believe in reincarnation? Or do you think the mind can invent the impossible? There are stories that hurt even before they're told. Tales that seem to come not from the mouth, but from the soul itself, as if they've been waiting for centuries to be released. This is the story of Leah, a 17-year-old Ecuadorian girl who was born with a scar on her right side, a curved, irregular, deep line, like an old wound that never fully healed. Since she was little, Leah felt a strange pain in that area. Doctors assured her it was just a birthmark, nothing serious, nothing clinical. But she said it burned, that it throbbed, that sometimes in her dreams she felt the exact moment that wound was inflicted, although not in this life. At age 12, the dreams began, always the same one. A dark room, a scream, a shadow lunging at her, and a stab wound in the side. She would wake up drenched in sweat, crying, saying someone had killed her, that it wasn't a nightmare, that she had lived it. Her mother, between superstition and concern, took her to a healer in Loja. The man, an elderly man with a penetrating gaze, saw the scar and said bluntly, "That wound is not from this life. It's a bodily memory, a memory of the soul." He recommended a hypnotic regression session. The family, skeptical but desperate, agreed. During the session, Leah fell into a deep trance. Her voice changed, her accent too. She began to speak like a woman from another era, describing in detail a coastal city they would later identify as Valparaiso, Chile. She said her name was Isadora Menendez, that it was 1932, that she worked as a governess, that she had fallen in love with a married man named Adrian, and that one night, upon discovering he had another lover, she was murdered out of jealousy, not by Adrian, but by the other woman. A precise stab wound to the right side, in the chest, exactly where the scar was. Everything was recorded. The therapist couldn't believe what he was hearing. The descriptions, the names, the places, everything matched historical records. In fact, a subsequent search revealed that in September 1932, a woman named Isadora Menendez had been found dead in a small apartment on Cerro Alegre Street in Valparaiso. The case was never solved, and her only wound was a stab wound in her right side, right where Leah had been born, marked. But the most terrifying thing was yet to come. After the regression, Leah began to have spontaneous memories, smells, names, songs from another time, and one constant image, a portrait of a woman with wavy hair, thin lips, and a melancholic gaze. She said it was her old self, that was her face before. Her mother, intrigued, took her to a gallery of old archives, and there, in a dusty police archive, they found a sepia-toned photo, identical to the one Leah described. It was Isadora. The shock was so great that the family decided to keep it a secret, but Leah couldn't keep silent any longer. She began to write, to document, to try to heal what she called an unresolved emotional debt. She said her soul hadn't been able to rest because she died with rage, with frustrated love, with betrayal in her heart. Curiously, since he began to speak openly about that past life, the pain in his scar began to lessen, as if releasing the story was also a way to exorcise the trauma. At 18, he traveled to Valparaiso. He walked the streets he remembered. He climbed the elevator hill. He cried in front of the apartment where he died. And he left a white rose there. He wasn't looking for justice, or proof, or fame. He was looking for relief. And upon returning to Ecuador, for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of shadows or knives. How can one explain that a scar on his body holds the memory of a death from another life? Could it be that the soul remembers what the body keeps silent? Tell me in the comments. Do you have any marks on your body that you could never fully explain? What if it was a sign of something you've already experienced and forgotten? In the city of Medellin, Colombia, lived two brothers, Julian and Esteban, just 3 years apart in age. From a young age, their relationship was a battleground. These weren't just childhood fights. These weren't normal squabbles. There was something more, an invisible tension, a suppressed rage, a cold hatred that couldn't be explained solely by jealousy or sibling rivalry. His mother, Sandra, always said it was as if they had known each other for a long time. The way they looked at each other, as if one was waiting for the other to make a mistake before attacking, was unusual. At 5 years old, Esteban pushed Julian down the stairs. He almost broke his neck. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "Because he had already killed me once." No one paid any attention to it. A game, maybe, a meaningless phrase. Until, over time, even stranger things continued to happen. Julian, for example, had recurring nightmares in which he ran through a barren field with crossfire all around him. In the dreams, he wore a uniform, carried a rifle, and screamed in a language he didn't know. He always ended up wounded, and when he turned his head, he saw a soldier approaching to finish him off. That soldier had Esteban's face. For his part, Esteban had panic attacks at loud noises, especially fireworks. He would hide under the bed and cry, shouting, "Don't shoot again, please don't shoot." The family considered trauma, but they had never experienced violence, not even robberies. Nothing justified those reactions. At 10 and 13 years old, respectively, the brothers participated in a school activity that included guided meditation. The therapist asked them to imagine a safe place, but Esteban began screaming in despair in the middle of the exercise. He said he couldn't close his eyes. He saw fire, dry land, bodies, and Julian shooting him. The school psychologist, baffled, recommended a more in-depth evaluation. So they were referred to a researcher specializing in childhood regression. The professional, without suggesting anything, conducted a series of individual sessions with each of them. What he discovered left everyone speechless. Julian recounted in harrowing detail what seemed like a past life as a soldier during the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s. He said his name was Ricardo, that he was 19 years old, that he was ambushed and wounded, and that he died at the hands of an enemy soldier. The face he described was that of his brother. Esteban, for his part, described the same war from the opposing side. His name was Mateo, and he said he hated the Bolivians, that one of them had killed his older brother in a previous battle, and that when he found Ricardo wounded, he didn't hesitate to shoot him, even though he no longer posed a threat. "I killed him in rage. I shouldn't have done it, but I did," he said through tears during the session. The parents, upon hearing the recordings, were overwhelmed. They had never spoken about that war. None of them had relatives who had participated in that conflict. There was no way for the children to know those details, not the names of border towns, the conditions of the battlefield, or the surnames of other soldiers they casually mentioned. After several weeks of therapeutic work, a joint session was attempted. The two brothers, still not fully understanding, stared at each other for long minutes. Julian said, "I didn't know it was you. I only remember the fear." Esteban responded, "I didn't know you still had that in your soul. I thought that when you died, it was erased." It was the first time they hugged. From that day on, their relationship began to change. They didn't become friends immediately, but the fighting subsided, the hatred subsided, respect began. As if, by remembering what they were, by reliving that moment when one ended the other's life, they had broken a chain. Today, the two teenagers live together without conflict. They don't talk much about it. They consider it part of something very big that they don't fully understand, but that they know is real. From time to time, Julian plays the guitar while Esteban draws in silence. And when someone asks them why they get along so well now, they just smile and say, "We don't have anything to charge each other anymore." Can the soul seek justice even across generations? Could karma disguise itself as family ties to settle scores stemming from ancient wars? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt a very intense connection, positive or negative, with someone without any apparent explanation? What if it was someone you already knew in another life, even as an enemy? When she was born, doctors said it was irreversible. Mariana came into the world without vision, total congenital blindness. No shapes, no shadows, only darkness. Her parents, humble farmers from the Salta region of Argentina, mourned the news as if it were a death sentence. But Mariana grew up in a way no one expected. From the age of 2, he began talking about things his parents couldn't understand. He described what the sky was like, brilliant blue, or how the leaves danced in the wind as the sun pierced them. He spoke of the deep red of ripe cherries and the golden glow of wheat before the harvest. At first they thought it was his imagination, maybe something he'd heard on the radio, but as he grew older, his way of describing the visual world became more complex, more precise. Too precise for someone who had never seen anything. At 6 years old, during a visit to the countryside, she stopped in front of a wildflower and said, "That's lavender. Its color is a soft violet that soothes the soul." Her mother, surprised, asked her how she could know that. Mariana replied matter-of-factly, "Because I've seen it in my other life." That was the first time he mentioned the subject. Over time, she began to talk about memories that weren't part of her current life. She said she used to be called Elena Duarte, that she lived in a big city with rivers and streetcars, that she worked as an art teacher, and that her hands were always stained with paint. She said she loved the color turquoise because it reminded her of the ocean she saw from her window at dawn. Her confused parents took Mariana to a neurologist. All tests confirmed her complete blindness from birth. However, her descriptions of colors, shadows, light and compositions were those of a skilled visual artist. It was then that they met a psychologist with experience in cases of transgenerational memory and reincarnation. She suggested a deep relaxation session to explore what Mariana claimed to remember. What happened in that session, recorded on audio, left everyone present breathless. Mariana, in a state of complete calm, began to speak with a different voice, more measured, more adult. She said she was in Lisbon, Portugal. The year was 1958. Her name was Elena Duarte, and she taught at an art school for women. She described in detail the streets, the smells of the port, the paintings she painted. She said she died in a domestic accident, a gas leak while she was sleeping. Her last memory was the sound of an explosion and an intense white light. After that regression, a search began, and although it was difficult, they found files in Portugal of a woman with that name who did indeed die in a fire caused by a gas leak in 1959. Her occupation, art teacher. She lived alone. She had no descendants. The most striking thing was a collection of his paintings, preserved by a local foundation. Mariana, without ever having seen them, described one of them accurately, a red lighthouse in the fog, with 2 birds flying to the left. When I showed her a relief image for the blind, she touched it with her hands and said, "This painting was mine." How was it possible? What followed was an internal transformation. Mariana began to express herself through tactile art. She modeled figures with a precision that impressed sculptors. She said she saw with her fingers. That shapes whispered colors to her, that although her physical eyes didn't work, her soul still remembered what it was like to see. At the age of 12, he won a national prize for sculpture for people with disabilities. When he took the stage, he told the entire audience, "Thank you for seeing my works. I don't need to see them. I've known them before." Since then, Mariana has become a powerful voice, not only in the art world, but also in spiritual circles. She has been interviewed in documentaries, conferences, and universities. She doesn't seek fame. Her message is clear: the essence of the soul does not die with the body, and sometimes memory finds paths beyond the senses. Many have attempted to find logical explanations: hyperesthesia, imagination, unconscious information. But none have been able to explain how a girl blind from birth could describe specific shades of light at dusk, or how she could tell the difference between navy blue and cobalt blue just by touching a piece of fabric. What if sight is not in the eyes, but in what the soul still holds? Tell me in the comments, do you think some people are born with memories from other lives? Have you ever felt like you knew something without ever having learned it? In a remote village in Guatemala, where the jungle still holds secrets that maps fear to trace, a boy named Balam was born. His mother, Ixchel, had him at home, assisted by his grandmother and a traditional midwife. From the first moment, there was something different about him. His eyes were not those of a newborn. He looked as if he knew something others had forgotten, and when he cried, he didn't do so like other babies. He did so with a strange, almost rhythmic cadence, as if his wails carried an ancient intonation. At 7 months old, Balam spoke his first word. It wasn't mama or papa. He said something that sounded like tokpak al. No one understood. They thought it was a babble. But as he repeated it several times, with emphasis and precision, his grandfather, an elderly man fluent in the classic Mayan language, paled. That means, offering ceremony to the god of fire, he murmured, his voice trembling. From then on, Balam began to speak more, but not in Spanish. He used words no one had taught him, words that not even his family, of deep indigenous ancestry, fully understood. They consulted with a linguist at the University of San Carlos. After listening to recordings of the boy, the specialist confirmed something extraordinary. Balam was speaking an archaic variant of Yucatec Mayan, a form of communication that had disappeared more than 1,000 years ago. How was it possible for a baby, without exposure to books, without television, without outside contact, to speak a dead language? The surprises did not end there. When Balam began walking, he insisted on going to a specific spot in the forest. Each time they passed by, he would stir, point his finger, and utter a phrase in his ancestral language, Kuhul u Naj. According to experts, this meant, the house of the sacred god is here. After several weeks of insistence, the family agreed. Led by the boy, they walked through trees, mud, and tangled roots until they reached a small mossy rise. There, Balam knelt, placed his hands on the earth, and began to murmur what sounded like a prayer. Archaeologists were alerted. Upon carefully excavating the designated site, they discovered something that defied all odds. A limestone crypt, hidden for centuries, with perfectly preserved inscriptions in the classic Mayan language. Inside were human remains wrapped in ritual cloths, jade figurines, and a stele telling the story of a priest named Ajkinam, the spiritual leader of the region, who died in 712 AD. But the most impressive thing wasn't the physical discovery. It was that Balam, without ever having seen the stele, already knew its contents. He recited it word for word in a low voice. He said that this was his temple, that he had taught there, that he was buried there when the skies darkened during the eclipse. And then he fell silent for several days. Investigators were baffled. The case was documented in an academic article that was never fully published, fearing academic skepticism. But the recordings exist. The records are preserved. And the people who were there, including villagers, archaeologists, and Balam's family, know they experienced something beyond all reason. Over time, Balam stopped speaking ancient Mayan. By the age of 5, he seemed to have forgotten everything. When questioned, he denied remembering. He said it was the stuff of dreams, but he could never explain why. When he touched a carved stone, he knew whether it was authentic or not. Why he could recognize symbols that no one had ever taught him. Today, Balam is 14 years old. He is a quiet, observant young man with a great talent for languages and history. His room is filled with maps, books about ancient civilizations, and drawings of temples that no one in his community has ever seen. When asked why he is so interested in the past, he just smiles and says, "Because sometimes I still hear it whispering inside me." How can we explain the fact that a child with no formal education speaks a dead language and reveals the exact location of a sacred burial? What if it's not just genetic memory, but soul memory? Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a memory, a word, or a dream that you felt wasn't yours, But you knew for sure. What if your soul was just awakening? Throughout his life, Marcos felt an irrational discomfort whenever he passed a church. He couldn't go in. He couldn't look at a lit candle without something inside him stirring. His hands sweated, his chest tightened, and an inner voice begged him, "Run, hide." He was born in Seville, Spain, to a traditional Catholic family. He was required to serve as an altar boy, but he never managed to feel at peace inside a church. At age 10, he fainted during Mass after seeing a torchlit procession. No one understood why. The doctors spoke of a phobia, the psychologists of childhood trauma, but there was no direct experience to justify this fear. No one had mistreated him, no one had frightened him with fire, and yet Marcos couldn't stand even the smell of incense. He said it reminded him of a damp, dark cell. At 28, already living in Mexico for work, his anxiety worsened. He dreamed of interrogations, of ropes, of marks on his skin. In his dreams, they always called him by another name, Gaspar, and they asked him to confess to pacts he didn't remember making. He always woke up with pain in his wrists and a burning sensation in his back. At her partner's insistence, she saw a therapist specializing in past life regression. She didn't believe in it, but she agreed, more out of desperation than faith. What happened in that session marked a turning point in her life. Under deep hypnosis, Marcos began to speak with a different voice. He claimed to be 36 years old. He lived in Toledo in the 17th century. He was a herbalist, working with plants and helping women with pain relief, childbirth, and spiritual ailments. His name was Gaspar del Olmo. He claimed his knowledge was ancestral and that he had learned it from his grandmother. He said he had never harmed anyone, but one day he was accused of witchcraft. He recounted the trial in detail. He said he was locked in a cold, windowless cell and forced to confess his heresy. He was tortured with hot irons. His greatest fear wasn't death, but that no one would remember the truth. He was burned in the main square before a crowd that called him a devil. As she spoke, she cried. She screamed. Her body trembled as if she were reliving every second. After the session, the therapist began investigating. She found partial records of a man named Gaspar del Olmo, accused by the Holy Office in 1643 of pagan and satanic practices. He was publicly executed. He had no known family. His last writings, never published, were archived in a private collection. Reading the copies, Marcos recognized exact phrases he had said under hypnosis. Phrases like, "I don't fear fire, I fear oblivion." He also identified drawings of herbs that, curiously, he had begun sketching as a child, without knowing their purpose. The most striking thing was his reaction upon visiting Toledo years later. He walked through streets he'd never set foot on, but which seemed familiar. He stopped in front of a closed chapel and said, "They prayed here before they killed me." And in front of an ancient fountain, he murmured, "I drank water here on my last day." Since that experience, her fear began to diminish. It didn't disappear completely. She still struggles to enter churches, but she's been able to attend weddings and baptisms without a crisis. Candles no longer cause her panic, although she still prefers natural light. And she has begun studying herbal medicine, as if resuming a path interrupted centuries ago. Marcos doesn't consider himself a victim, nor does he consider himself a chosen one. He says he simply recovered a part of himself that had been trapped in the fire, and now he can live in peace, knowing that death didn't defeat him, it only transformed him. Can a soul carry the trauma of an unjust execution for generations? What if our deepest fears aren't born in this life, but in one we're trying to forget? Tell me in the comments, do you ever feel fear for no logical reason? What if it's a scar on your soul? She had never lit a candle again, not one. Since that night when the fire stole what was most sacred from her, Julia decided that the flame was the enemy of her soul. Her son, Matthias, barely 5 years old, had died in a fire that consumed their small house in Cordoba, Argentina. Julia was outside at the market. It only took 15 minutes. When she returned, smoke was already covering everything. She tried, she ran, she burned her hands breaking the window, but it was too late. Matthias was inside, and he was no longer breathing. The following years were a dark tunnel. Depression, guilt, loneliness. Julia moved, changed her name, ran away from everything. She promised not to have more children, never to reopen that piece of her heart that had been reduced to ashes. Until at age 41, already living in Tucumán, she unexpectedly became pregnant, an accident, or perhaps fate. During her pregnancy, she had recurring dreams about Matthias, but not like she had at 5 years old. Instead, he was older, with a look full of compassion, as if to say, "Don't be afraid." The pregnancy was silent. Julia didn't tell anyone about the dreams. She was afraid of going crazy. When Santiago was born, something happened. It wasn't just the physical resemblance. It was the way he looked at her, a mature and direct gaze, too profound for a newborn. And as the months passed, the signs began to appear. At 2 years old, Santiago started calling Julia Mama Julita, exactly like Matthias had called her. No one else used that nickname. At age 3, while leafing through a photo album he kept hidden, Santiago pointed to a picture and said, "That's me. But I was little back then." Julia froze. It was a photo of Matthias in his old room. Santiago had never seen that image. He didn't even know his brother existed. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because I remember that room, and the window that broke when I was falling asleep in the smoke." Julia collapsed. It was impossible, it was unacceptable, but it was real. From then on, Santiago began to describe details of the old house. He talked about the puppy that had already died, about the smell of the soap she used to wash the sheets, and about the fire. He said he saw a white light, that it floated, that he cried because he didn't want to leave it alone, and that someone had told him, "You'll come back when I'm ready." At 5, the age at which Matthias died, Santiago wrote his name in his brother's handwriting. Julia kept an old note written by Matthias and compared it. Identical, every curve, every slope. The psychologists consulted said it could be a projection of her mother, an unconscious influence, a coincidence. But Julia knew. Deep down, she knew. Santiago was terrified of fire. He could never be near bonfires. One birthday, they turned off the lights to sing Happy Birthday and lit candles. Santiago panicked. He screamed. He cried. He hugged Julia and said, "I don't want that to happen to me again." After that episode, Julia decided not to hide the truth from him anymore. She told him about Matthias. She showed him the photos, the drawings, the toys she had saved. Santiago listened to everything in silence. Then he said, "Thanks for waiting for me." Today, Santiago is 12 years old. He no longer remembers everything as he used to. He says his memories fade, like smoke carried away by the wind. But he still dreams of places he's never visited, still knows details of things he's never experienced, and he still calls Julia Mama Julita, even when she asks him to stop. Julia, for her part, found peace, not because Matthias had returned, but because she understood that the soul isn't lost. It simply moves, transforms, and finds itself again. Can a soul return to finish an unfinished story? What if the love between mother and son transcends time, the body, and even death? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt like someone in your current life had already loved you in another? What if that person came back for you? Javier always felt a strange nostalgia for something he couldn't name. Since he was a child, he was drawn to old uniforms, high boots, pocket compasses, and time-worn maps. But these weren't just tastes. It was a silent obsession. He drew trenches, metal helmets, rifles with bayonets, without knowing where these images came from. When people asked him at school why he didn't play like the others, he would reply, "I already played with that. I was in the war." His parents, who live in Viña del Mar, Chile, thought it was just his imagination. Javier had never had access to military history books before he was 10 years old. He would, however, say things like, "Shell fires didn't scare me, but mustard gas did," or, "When they shot me in the leg, I knew I wouldn't go back to the front. These phrases were so naturally recited that they caused a stir. At 16, still in high school, Javier had an episode during a class on the First World War. Watching footage of the Battle of the Somme, he paled, trembled, and whispered, "I was there. It was hell." He was taken to the infirmary. He didn't have a fever, he wasn't sick, but his heart was pounding as if he'd escaped an explosion. After this episode, a history teacher, intrigued by his students' behavior, began talking to him outside of class. What he discovered was astonishing. Javier could describe military tactics used in the trenches, name French generals, and even describe ancient weapons, such as the Lee Enfield rifle or the Vickers machine gun, in great technical detail. All this without having formally studied the conflict. The professor shared the case with a memory regression researcher who suggested gentle hypnosis just for research. Javier, with his parents' permission, agreed. In an altered state of consciousness, his voice changed. He gave his name as Thomas Walter Granger. He was a British soldier born in 1893 in Manchester. He recalled his childhood in poverty, his conscription in 1914, and his fighting on several fronts. He spoke of his constant fear of being buried, the noise of rats, and the rotting of his wet boots for weeks. He said he had lost friends, and that in 1916 on the Somme, an explosion left him with severe injuries to his left leg. He was evacuated. He died of gangrene months later in a military hospital. He was 23 years old. All this information was recorded. After the session, the researcher and the professor searched British military records. And yes, there was a Thomas W. Granger, born in Manchester in 1893, who died of a post-war infection in 1916. The records described exactly the same hospital Javier mentioned. But the most disturbing thing came later. Javier began experiencing recurring pain in his left leg, a genuine physical discomfort with no apparent medical cause. He also developed a fear of closed, damp spaces. He said, "The mud was eating me up inside." Certain songs with military marches made him cry for no apparent reason. Despite this, he began to write. He created a fictional trench diary, but what began as fiction soon became something more, fragments of memories, or simply unconscious reconstructions. No one knew for sure. His accounts moved even veterans of recent wars who said, "No one can write like that unless they've been there." At 20, Javier decided to study history and specialize in 20th century conflicts. He visited Europe. He set foot on the Somme battlefield. He remained silent for hours. Then he wrote in his notebook, "Today, finally, I came home." Is it possible for a war to leave its mark even on those who have not yet been born? What if some soldiers don't die at all, but wait, are reincarnated and revived to tell what history forgot? Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt a fear, a memory, or a connection to a place you've never been to? What if you'd already been there, under a different name? Daniela was always a practical woman. No tarot, no astrology, no mysticism, a psychologist by profession, trained in Buenos Aires. She had an analytical, Cartesian mind, until she began having dreams about a man she had never seen in her life. At first, she believed it was a manifestation of the subconscious, nothing unusual, but night after night the figure repeated itself. It was always the same man, with very light eyes, a thin beard, and a small scar on his chin. In the dreams, they didn't speak much. They looked at each other. They hugged. There was an intense sensation as if time had stopped. In one of her most vivid dreams, he held her hand and said, "I've been searching for you for 3 lifetimes. Don't leave me again." When she woke up, Daniela was agitated, tears in her eyes. She had never felt so much pain for someone who didn't exist. The most disturbing thing came when, weeks later, she attended an international psychology conference in Quito. During a coffee break, she saw him, standing next to a table. It was him, the man from the dream, the same scar, the same gaze. For a second, she thought she was dreaming again, but no. His name was Gabriel, Chilean, a transpersonal therapist. When their eyes met, they both fell silent. Something very profound, inexplicable invaded them, as if the soul remembered what the mind couldn't process. It wasn't a physical attraction. Foi reconhecimento. They spoke little that day, but Daniela returned to the hotel with a strange feeling. She knew what he smelled like. She knew the tone of his laugh. She knew he was limping slightly in his right leg, even before he mentioned that he had injured it playing soccer years before. The meetings continued throughout the conference, and one afternoon, in the hotel garden, Gabriel said something Daniela would never forget. "Have you dreamed about me too?" She froze. She hadn't told anyone. Gabriel explained that for the past 2 months he'd been dreaming of a woman with sad eyes and delicate hands. She wore old dresses, and he felt he'd already lost her. In each dream, she walked away from him, and he cried, "This time, don't forget me." Daniela and Gabriel began a relationship, but it wasn't easy. They both felt there was something unresolved between them, a kind of tension that stemmed not from the present but from the past. And it was on a trip to southern Chile, to an old village where everything changed. As they walked along the cobblestone streets, Daniela felt a sense of déjà vu so intense it made her dizzy. She recognized that church, that square, that blue house with wooden windows. They entered an antique shop, and among the old photos, Daniela pointed to one and said, "That's us." It was a black and white photo from 1908, a young couple with similar features. The man had the same scar on his chin. The woman had the same sad look. On the back of the photo it said, "Married in 1907, Antonia and Elias." Daniela broke down. She began to cry without understanding why. She missed him, as if she had been waiting for him for over a century. Over the next few months they searched for records, and curiously, they found documents belonging to a couple who lived in that same area. The woman died young of pneumonia. He never remarried. They say he wrote letters to her every day until his death. Gabriel, who had never believed in reincarnation, changed his perspective on life. So did Daniela. They decided not to force anything, just to live. If they were going to heal what they couldn't before, they should do it calmly, with awareness. Today they live together. When they argue, they smile and say, "You and me again, learning to love better." Can love overcome death, time, and start over in another body? What if there are encounters that are not a coincidence, but a second or third chance that the universe grants us? Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt such a deep connection with someone who seemed to be from another life? What if the reunion was already written? In a coastal town in Peru, where the Pacific Ocean roars like an ancient echo that never falls silent, a girl named Abril was born. From her earliest years, her mother noticed she had a disproportionate fear of water. She couldn't stand long baths. She cried when it rained heavily, and if she was taken to the beach, she would scream as if something invisible was dragging her. "I don't want to go back there. My throat hurt." I couldn't scream. She was only 3 years old when she said that phrase. Her family, religious but practical, thought it was a hereditary trauma or a phase of her life. But as the years passed, the fear only grew. Abril said the water swept her away, that she tried to escape, but the rocks cut her feet, and that no one heard me when I screamed. At age 5, she began having recurring nightmares about a wooden bridge, a strong current, and a little girl who slipped and was swept away. She claimed that the little girl was herself. She always ended the dream by saying, "I didn't want to die like that. I was scared. I just wanted to play." Things got worse when the school organized a field trip to the river. Abril panicked. She vomited. She broke out in a cold sweat. And through tears, she whispered to her teacher, "If I go there, I'll never come back." The family, already distraught, sought out a local holistic therapist known for working with childhood regressions. During a light-hearted session, guided only by stories, Abril began recounting fragments of a past life. She said her name was Valeria, that she lived in a house near a river in another town, that her grandmother sold empanadas in the plaza, and that one day she ran away from home to play alone on the bridge, even after her mother told her not to, that she slipped, that she fell, and that the current was as cold as needles. The most disturbing part, he said his body was never found, that it was dragged over rocks, trapped between submerged logs, and that his mother at the time waited for years, watching the river, unaware that it was already far away. The information seemed random, but with the therapist's help, the family began investigating. They discovered that 18 years before April's birth, a girl named Valeria Espinosa had disappeared under similar circumstances in a neighboring town. She was 7 years old. She slipped off a wooden bridge and was swept away by the current. Her body was never found. April, who had never been there, accurately described the bridge, her grandmother's house, and the stone path. She asked for a ride. When they arrived, he pointed to a secluded corner of the riverbank, covered in bushes. He said, "I stayed there. No one looked over there." With the permission of local authorities and the presence of experienced divers, they conducted a symbolic search, more out of respect than conviction. And to everyone's surprise, they found remnants of children's clothing among logs and rocks. Samples were sent for analysis. Without much fanfare, experts confirmed that the fabrics were compatible with those worn by the girl who disappeared in the 1990s. It was all that remained, but it was something. Valeria's elderly ex-mother was discreetly warned. Upon seeing April for the first time, she wept inconsolably. She said there was something in the girl's eyes, something familiar, something no medical or logical explanation could explain. And April, timidly, simply took her hand and said, "I never wanted to leave you alone. You always looked at the river, and I listened to you." Today, April has overcome her fear of water. She still doesn't like the ocean, but now she can dip her feet in it without panicking. She says that since the day they returned to the river and brought Valeria home, the nightmares have stopped. At the age of 9, he wrote in his diary, "Maybe we're not new, maybe we're just continuing, trying to finish what was left unfinished. What if the memories of a tragic death remain trapped in the soul, waiting for a new opportunity to be released? Tell me in the comments, do you think it's possible to go back and heal a wound you couldn't close before? What if that's already happening to you without you even knowing it?" His name was Emiliano. He was born in Cuenca, Ecuador, to a family with no ties to Eastern religions. He was raised in a traditional Catholic home with few books and no internet access until he was 15. However, from the moment he began to speak, his mother noticed something different. Sometimes, Emiliano would sit cross-legged on the floor and remain silent for long periods. People called him, but he didn't respond. He said he was inside and didn't want to go back yet. At the age of 6, without any instruction, he began to make rhythmic chant-like sounds. His family thought it was just his imagination. But one day, during a visit to a Buddhist temple open to tourists, a monk heard him murmur one of those phrases and stopped dead in his tracks. What Emiliano repeated over and over was an ancient purification mantra taught only in specific schools of Tibetan monks, usually in closed retreats. When the monk asked him where he had learned it, Emiliano simply replied, "I didn't learn it, I remembered it." At 8 years old, Emiliano began drawing strange symbols in his notebooks. They looked like characters from the Tibetan alphabet. He had never heard of that language. His mother showed the drawings to an Oriental languages teacher who confirmed, yes, they were real letters with small errors, like someone trying to remember something they used to know perfectly but have now lost track of the details. Over time, Emiliano began to describe vivid memories of a past life. He said he had lived high above the world, where the wind was faint and the snow was silent. He remembered praying every day at dawn, playing metal singing bowls, and walking along stone walkways between colorful flags that danced in the breeze. He believed his name was Tenzin. He died at age 42 during an avalanche while trying to rescue a young monk trapped on the trail. He recounted it all with terrifying serenity. The family, still skeptical, decided to take him to a past life therapist. During a regression, Emiliano entered a deep state and began to speak in ancient Tibetan. His voice changed, so did his posture. He mentioned Rongbuk Monastery, north of Everest, accurately describing the layout of the rooms, the inner courtyard, the sounds of prayers, and even the color of the entrance curtains. The information was compared with archives and images, and it was accurate. Emiliano had never traveled. He never had access to this content, and yet he knew details that not all visitors to the monastery could perceive. After the regression, something changed in him. He no longer feared death. He began waking up before dawn to meditate. He learned to control his emotions with a maturity unusual for his age. The teachers said he looked like a small adult, and whenever he could, he sought refuge in silence. He said it was to listen to what still resonated within him. At 17, Emiliano won a scholarship and traveled to Nepal. He visited the monastery, he remembered. He cried upon entering. He recognized a broken bell that he said he had rung in his past life. An elderly monk, hearing him chant a forgotten mantra, said, "Some don't need to learn again. They just need to remember who they were." Today, Emiliano lives between two worlds. He studies philosophy in the West, but returns to the Himalayas whenever he can. He doesn't seek proof. He doesn't seek fame. He says his role is simply to continue the path he embarked on before, with the same silence, the same compassion, and the same certainty that the body changes, but the vocation remains. Can the soul continue its mission even after changing body, country, and language? What if some of us were once teachers and are just coming back to teach from another location? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt a sense of wisdom or knowledge that you don't know where it came from? What if you'd already learned it in another life? Since she was little, Clara avoided mirrors. It wasn't a common phobia. It was a visceral, irrational panic. She couldn't see herself reflected. She couldn't stand the slightest glint in the glass. When she passed by a mirror, she would look down, cover her face, or run away. Her worried parents tried therapy, prayer, even spiritual cleansings, but nothing worked. Clara cried every time she had to go into a bathroom with a mirrored door. She would say that someone was watching her from the other side. At 7 years old, one stormy night, she hid under her bed after accidentally seeing her reflection in a wet window. Between sobs, she repeated, "I don't want to stay there again." Her mother thought she was having a nervous breakdown, but her father, more sensitive to spiritual themes, began writing down what Clara said in moments of deep fear. Over time, they noticed a pattern. She spoke of a dark room full of candles, of people in a circle singing strange things, and of a large mirror with a gold frame that glowed like fire. Clara said she was trapped there, that she screamed but no one heard her, and that she saw her own reflection crying on the other side, asking to get out. At age 10, during a session with a holistic therapist recommended by a relative, Clara entered a state of deep relaxation. In a light trance, she began recounting disjointed but vivid memories. She claimed to be named Maren, to live somewhere in ancient Scotland, and to have been accused of playing with grass and shadows. She said that some older women had taken her to some kind of nighttime ritual, where they forced her to stand in front of a mirror. They described the object precisely: a frame carved with rune-like symbols, a slightly opaque crystal with a dark spot in the lower left corner. They said it would protect her, but when the ritual began, something went wrong. Clara cried during the session. She said she felt her soul being pulled, that her image began to move independently, and that she screamed, but no one heard her. "I saw myself on the other side, but it wasn't me anymore. It was something else. And ever since, I've been looking for a way back." After the session, the therapist began a personal investigation. And surprisingly, she found references in ancient Scottish texts to a ritual called the mirror trap, in which mirrors were used to ward off supposed witches or rogue spirits. Some more sinister versions spoke of soul imprisonment. Clara began drawing the mirror she had seen in her dreams. Her mother, curious, showed the drawing to an antique dealer who recognized the object, a mirror with a Celtic frame from a private collection in Edinburgh. It had never been on public display. But upon seeing photographs, Clara exclaimed, "That's the one! They left me there." The case came to the attention of a group of reincarnation scholars who proposed a visit to the site. Clara, now 14, hesitated but accepted. During the visit, as she approached the real mirror, she froze. She cried. She said she felt as if a part of me had come home. He touched the mirror. He closed his eyes. And he said, "I'm not afraid anymore. I can go out now." From that day on, Clara changed. She began to tolerate mirrors, to look into her own eyes. She said that the connection was broken, that now only the light can pass through. Her dreams ceased, her anxiety diminished, and she began to study ancient symbolism as if something inside her had finally awakened or been freed. Today, at 18, Clara writes about archetypes, mirrors, dimensions, and memories of the soul. She doesn't seek fame, but she wants no one else to carry the fear that she's carried for so long without understanding why. When Daniel was barely 4 years old, his parents noticed something wasn't normal. While other children played with cars or buildings, he drew barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and very thin human figures with empty faces. When asked what it was, he replied, "Where we lived before." The bad men screamed a lot. It was cold, and the soup smelled bad. They lived in Rosario, Argentina. None of their relatives were Jewish. There was no direct reference to the Holocaust at home. Daniel naturally said things like, "If you make noise, they'll whip you," or "My brother left on the train and never came back." His parents considered the possibility of psychological disorders. They took him to specialists, but tests showed no trauma or imbalance. Only an unusual imagination and extreme sensitivity to noise, crowds, and above all, fences. At age 6, during a school trip to a local history museum, they stopped in front of a model of a concentration camp. Daniel paled. He fell to his knees and began to cry uncontrollably. He cried, "I don't want to go back there. Please, no more trains." The school contacted the family. The parents, unsure of what to do, sought out a therapist specializing in regression. During a playful session, without hypnosis, just open-ended questions, Daniel began to speak German. Scattered words. Expressions like Nein, Bitte, Schutzstaffel. He had never studied another language. He had had no contact with foreigners. But he seemed to remember more than just sounds. He remembered fear. Over time, he revealed more fragments. He said his name was Jakob, that he had an older brother named Samuel, that his mother wore a yellow scarf, and that they were taken in carriages packed with people who couldn't breathe properly. He said they were separated upon arrival, that his head was shaved, and that he lived in a place with wooden beams and the smell of death. In one session, he pulled out a number, 142684. He said it was his number. The therapist, after investigating, found Nazi concentration camp records. And yes, that number appeared on a partial list of Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz. The associated name, Jakob Eisenstein, born in Poland, died at age 9. Daniel was 7 years old when he first drew that number. Later, when he saw an old photo in a book about the Holocaust, he pointed to a boy with a shaved head and sad eyes. That was my brother. He never came back. No rational explanation seemed satisfactory. The previously skeptical parents began to accept that something was inexplicable. They didn't encourage the stories, but they didn't reject them either. They simply listened. They welcomed them. They helped. At age 10, Daniel began to forget details, but he still had nightmares about screaming guards and rain and smoke. He developed a deep sense of justice. He hated bullying. He protected the weak. He said, "No one should ever be pushed onto a train again without knowing their destination." Today, Daniel is a teenager. His memory is no longer clear, But he still visits synagogues, even though he's not Jewish. He says he feels at peace there, that somehow there are people there who know me, even if they don't speak to me. Can such a traumatic memory traverse bodies, languages, and generations to find solace? What if some souls return, just so the world doesn't forget what can't be repeated? Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt a deep sadness for no apparent reason, as if you were mourning a story that wasn't yours, but belonged to your soul?